is brought to you by Head Start Basketball.
Hi, this is Don Showalter from USA Basketball, and you are listening to the Hoop Heads Podcast.
Hey Hoop Heads! Wanted to take a minute to shout out our partners and friends at Dr. Dish Basketball. Their Dr. Dish shooting machines are undoubtedly the most advanced and user-friendly machines on the market, and they truly accelerate skill development faster than ever. Learn more at drdishbasketball.com and follow their incredible content at Dr. Dish B-Ball on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Mention the Hoop Heads podcast and save an extra $300 on the Dr. Dish Rebel, All-Star, and CT models. Also, make sure to check out the new Dr. Dish Home Machine, which is perfect for these crazy times when gyms and schools are closed. Visit drdishbasketball.com for details. That's a great deal, Hoop Heads. Get your Dr. Dish shooting machine today.
I'm continuing to educate myself, and I've never stopped learning. And so I continue to learn and apply even the things that are in the game now on top of what I already knew.
Jim Psaras is the director of Psaras Skills Academy and the former coach at Rogers High School in Newport, Rhode Island. Psaras coached basketball for 29 seasons in Newport, his first season at Thompson Middle School, his second with the Rogers freshmen, his third with the Rogers Junior Varsity, and the last 26 seasons as the head boys varsity coach at Rogers. Jim retired from coaching in March of 2014. Jim's coaching career was greatly impacted by the opportunity to work and learn at the famed five-star basketball camp. Although he is retired from high school coaching, through his Psaras Skills Academy and Viking basketball camp, he continues to give back to the game. The foundation of the Psaras Skills Academy philosophy is to show players how to work hard, teach players how to work and play smart, and inspire players to work consistently once training is over. Players will learn the level of effort required to play successful basketball, as well as how to train with purpose to get there. If you have a chance to leave us a 5-star rating and review on your favorite podcast app, we would really appreciate it. Tell your friends in the coaching community about the show, and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. Check out hoopheadspod.com, where you can listen to every episode we've ever recorded and find out more about what drives our show. Be prepared to listen and learn throughout this episode with Jim Psaras from Psaras Skills Academy and Rogers High School in the state of Rhode Island. Hello and welcome to the Hoop Heads Podcast. It's Mike Klinzing here without my co-host Jason Sunkel this morning, but I am pleased to be joined by longtime Rhode Island high school coach Jim Psaras. Jim, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Excited to have you on, get a chance to dig into all of the great things that you've been able to do in the game of basketball throughout your long career. Want to start out back at the beginning of this journey when you were a kid and talk to me a little bit about how you got into the game when you were younger, what made you fall in love with the game of basketball.
I just found love. I mean, there wasn't much to do when I was younger. There was only 3 channels to watch on TV. And I just gravitated to basketball. I mean, I'd go out in the wintertime and shovel snow and shoot in the wintertime. And just found a love for the game and a passion that I didn't really know was a love and passion at the time. And I just continued to play in Flo Harvey leagues and the YMCA leagues, and even part of my church, playing with them, and just continue to play and really play not in the middle school. I actually played in elementary school. We used to have an elementary 4th and 5th grade team, and one of my teachers, my first coach in elementary school, was great, and it kind of got me started.
What was it about the game that hooked you? Because obviously in your era, my era, you were probably playing multiple things outside with neighborhood kids and running around and all that stuff. So what was it about basketball, the game specifically, that hooked you?
I think it was the ability to play with another group of people, multiple people, not like, in baseball sometimes it felt like, we'd hit the ball and, it just was like a one-on-one situation. And I felt like, playing tennis, it was like we'd go up to the park and play tennis all day. I just felt like, you know what, it was like basketball was other guys involved on your team against another team, and it just kind of gravitated towards me, that team aspect, and that's why I think I started to love it so much.
Who was your player that you looked up to? Who was who were you a big fan of when you were a kid? Who did you like watching?
Julius Erving. when I really like kind of started watching the NBA a little bit, Julius Erving was the first person. And then after that, obviously being from the New England area, after Julius Erving, it was obviously Larry Bird and Magic Johnson. But Julius Erving was for sure the first. I remember having a winter hat with a Philadelphia 76ers hat.
That's very cool. Doc was my guy too. I still remember. I have vague. So when in the 77 championship, I have very vague memories of seeing that. And obviously at that point, the finals were on tape delay at 11:30. So I was like 7 or 8 years old. So I wasn't staying up for those. But I have vague memories of those highlights and kind of the legend of Dr. J. And then the Dr. J Converse All-Stars, sort of the first real leather basketball shoe when we all graduated from Chuck Taylor's. Those were the shoes that I couldn't wait to someday put on my feet. And that was the first, quote, real pair of basketball shoes I ever had, were the Converse All-Stars that Doc wore. And I think he was just a guy that was so charismatic and played so differently and above the rim compared to a lot of guys in that era. I think there were a lot of kids probably that were of a similar age to you and I that Doc was probably their first guy.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. And the other one was Elvin Hayes. He used to go over to the corner of my court, and I used to shoot a shot every time, same spot, and it was a sweet spot. But Elvin Hayes was the other one that just came back to mind.
The Big E.
The Big E.
Those are good times. It's funny now that we've had more time. I don't know about you, but I've kind of, probably not as much as some people, but I have gone back and checked out different YouTube clips of games and historic games. And it's funny to go back and watch things that you have this vague memory of in your mind. And then you go back and you watch them live, or, obviously not live, but you're watching the entire game. And it's funny just to compare your memory of what you thought went on or what you thought it was like compared to what you were actually seeing. And it's just, that's been a lot of fun, which is something that normally in our everyday life, at least for me, I don't necessarily have the time to go back and watch those historic games. It's been a lot of fun to do that. In fact, thinking of what we're just talking about here, I got to go back and I got to watch some vintage Dr. J here in the next couple of days, probably.
I think I'm going to try that myself.
It's a lot of fun. I've watched I watched a couple of Jordan games. I watched some Lakers Celtics, from the vintage Magic Bird era. So those games have been fun, and it's nice to see, especially as you think about seeing those guys at the age that they are now, whether you see them at a press conference or whatever, when Magic was the GM of the Lakers, and obviously Bird's been a little bit out of the spotlight for the last couple of years, but to go back and see them at their peak is pretty incredible.
Oh yeah, for me, at that time I was probably 14, 15, and watching Larry Bird and Magic Johnson, bring the life back to basketball was just such a pivotal time for the game of basketball, and obviously Michael Jordan after that. But for me, it was like, the no-look pass, and that's kind of a certain part of the game that I modeled. I try to follow that model of the no-look pass and be a great passer and be a great teammate. So, that was impactful times for the game of basketball. And I think those two had a big part to do with it, obviously, with Michael Jordan following.
Yeah, no doubt that Bird and Magic, when you think about where the NBA was in the late 70s, early 80s, and the sort of dwindling popularity of the league, and then those two came in with their personalities and their rivalry, and one East Coast, one West Coast, and just kind of their, I wouldn't say their contrasting styles, because they both obviously played an unselfish game and were passers, and I think that was something that the public kind of latched on to, because the league had sort of gotten this selfish reputation and whatever, and they were able to turn it around. And then, as you said, followed by Michael, who took that popularity to an even greater level. So thinking back to your time when you were playing, talk a little bit about your high school career. Maybe give us a favorite memory or two from your time as a high school player.
Well, when I was in high school, when we had our middle school had ninth grade in it at the time, before it became part of the high school a few years later. And I didn't try out. I didn't have any push or any kind of guidance to go out for the middle school team, or kind of, my family just wasn't didn't push me at all. So when I got into high school, I remember going out actually as a freshman, as a ninth grader, and getting cut. And then the next year, just didn't have any mentorship to say, continue to plug away. And I ended up not going out, which I look back now and I try to share with kids, to continue to try. And I ended up being as a sophomore, like the manager of the basketball team for my eventual high school coach. And then the next year I went out, I actually worked harder and made the varsity as the backup point guard as a junior. But I felt like I had lost a year, because I did not play as a sophomore. And then my senior year, I was a starting point guard. I ended up breaking my thumb halfway through the year. But my fondest memory of my high school was playing a school, and I remember one of my teammates taking a shot with I think we were either down one or tied, and I reversed the ball from the top of the key, and he was in the corner, and he took the shot, and I just went and crashed weak side on the rebounds and caught the ball in the air and tapped it in as the buzzer went off, and we won the game, and that was my fondest memory.
Yeah, there's nothing better than a buzzer beater.
Oh, yeah, it was great. I remember it like it was last night.
I hear you. There's nothing better. My own favorite high school memory is we were playing my rival last home game as a senior, and I made a shot from probably about the circle, what they would call, you think of the Steph Curry, Trae Young shots, sort of from that area at the buzzer to beat our rival. And that was last home game as a senior. So that buzzer beater, that feeling of winning a game and then having your teammates mob you and just all that goes along with what happens when you beat the buzzer. That's something that, as you said, feels like it was just yesterday. I can instantly recall what that felt like, what it looked like. It's a memory that I'll be 96 years old and still telling that story to anybody who will listen. So I can completely relate to that being your favorite memory.
Absolutely. So,
and I think that the other thing there that you talked about, which I think is an important lesson, is when you said that you wish that you had tried out and that you had some more guidance for somebody saying, hey, you should continue to pursue. If this is what you want to do, it should be something that you should continue to pursue. And I think that a lot of times what kids forget, and there's all kinds of reasons why kids decide not to play, but whenever I'm having that type of conversation with a kid, my thought and the thing that I try to share with them is you don't ever get a chance to go back and do it again. So if you don't try out for your high school team, or you get cut and you give up, if it's something that you really love to do, you got to continue to pursue it, because you can't be 24 years old and suddenly say, oh, I wish I would have gone and played high school basketball. That opportunity is only there in front of you once, and you never get it back. And so I think that story that you shared about not going out and not really having somebody kind of guide you in that decision-making process is something that I'm sure you probably used with your teams and your kids that you coached over the years.
Yeah, and as well, it was my children. Yes, definitely with my teams and my players, different moments that came up, difficulty they were having and challenges, whatever it might be, off the court, at home. But like even with my kids, I told them when they enter their freshman year at high school, I go, listen, you've got, only 12 sports seasons, extracurricular activity opportunities, for your career, and they will go by fast. And before you know it, you'll only have like 6 opportunities. You'll have 2 years left. So I've kind of shared that with them to take advantage of the opportunities that you have and the opportunities to grow in relationships with your teammates and your coaches.
Absolutely. I don't think there's any question about that. So as you look at your finishing up playing and thinking about coaching, talk to me when you first got an idea that maybe coaching would be something that you'd be interested in. How did you come to that realization? Was it something that happened quickly, or was it something that kind of gradually over time you had always known from the time you were a kid that coaching might be something that you were interested in?
I think you'd have to ask my friends, but I think I was always a team player and always trying to help people. And at the time, it was maybe trying to teach them in a way, but help. But it kind of happened by accident. I had gone to school after high school, college, and I enrolled, and I was in a major I didn't like, and I ended up transferring to the University of Rhode Island. And it was kind of like starting a little bit over. And I remember going to our high school football game and running into my former head coach, and he said to me, he was working the gate collecting tickets. He said, would you be interested in coaching? And I said, sure. What would it be? He said, our middle school program, that I had gone through was Thompson Middle School, needs a coach. So long story short, that's where I started. And then I have a very interesting, what happened to me over those next 3 or 4 years was kind of unique. So I coached that first team, and it was unique because there was players on that team that I was able to build a relationship with, because the next year started, I was back at the middle school coaching 8th grade, and about a week into it, the freshman coach had left for his job responsibilities had changed, so he couldn't devote the time. So then I was promoted up to the freshman program the second year. So now I'm second year. At the same time, I'm beginning my college time as a student. Well, third year comes around, and the JV coach is a teacher, and he's not going to coach the JVs anymore. The JV position opens up, and I put in for it, and I get it. Meanwhile, I'm still an undergraduate taking a full load of classes, scheduling everything in the morning, early afternoon, so I could be around for practices, games. Well, really, I mean, it just doesn't happen, but my head coach leaves the next year to become a volunteer assistant at Division I school, University of Rhode Island. So now I put in for the position, and I get the position. So in 4 years, I went, from 8th grade right up the ladder. And mind you, those kids that I started with, they came with me, or, we came together, and then obviously added kids from each class as we moved up the ladder. And then, so I became the head coach of the varsity at the age of 23, while still an undergraduate full-time student at the University of Rhode Island.
All right, so I got a lot of questions here. So let's start out with, I'll start at the beginning of that story, and then I'll move to the, quote, end of the story, which is really the beginning of your varsity career. So that first year when you coach, obviously you're a pretty young kid at that point. What do you remember about standing in front of your team for the first time I assume you were 19, 20 years old at that point when you got that first middle school job. What do you remember about standing in front of that group for the first time as their coach?
I thought I knew it all, but I had no idea what I was getting into as I reflect back. As I reflect back 35 years, it was just what I can remember is just here I am, not many years ahead of them. I mean, at that point, and I'm like, man, I'm starting to do something that, is great. I'm giving back, but I just felt like from within, the passion was there, and it was starting to come out. And obviously I had no idea what I was doing. And from the perspective of what now as what you started with, and we would all say that. So I would just remember being there, but I remember just starting to build the relationships. That's what to me was really big with the relationship with that group, because it became so unique that I had no idea what was going to happen and what was going to transgress over the next, 4, 5, 10, 20 years.
I'm assuming, and just guessing based on what little I know about you at this point, that a lot of those kids, since you spent 6 years with some of them as their coach all the way up through the varsity level, I'm assuming that some of those kids you still occasionally have contact with even today.
Oh, some of them are really close friends. I'll go to games in the local area, playoff games, regular season games. They'll sit next to me. I'll sit next to them. We'll drive up in a car. I conversate with all. Some of them were in my wedding, my first, when I got married, and it's just been unbelievable. And they're still in my lives. I actually, I actually work with a couple, so it's just the relationships have just continued to just bloom, and it's just been a great, a fortunate opportunity for me.
Yeah, I think the ability to build that kind of relationship and spend that many years with a group of kids has got to be very, very special, because as you said, that's a very, very unique situation where not many people, both on the playing side and the coaching side, would have that opportunity to spend that many years in a row, unless you're in the professional ranks where you're staying with a franchise for years and years and years, which even that is becoming rarer and rarer. It's not too often that players and coach spend 6 years together the way that those kids would have had the opportunity to do with you. And that's just a very, I'm sure, unique and special situation. And clearly from what you described in terms of the relationships that you still have with those kids today, that's just, again, what a blessing to be able to start out with that right off the gate, in your coaching career. And then you get up to the varsity level and you're still a college student. So talk a little bit about how you balanced being a full-time college student and coaching. One thing to coach middle school basketball, even that I think would probably be a challenge for most people. But now you step up and you're the varsity coach, and you may or may not have known at that point what all that entailed. But just thinking about that from the perspective of what's required of a high school varsity coach, just talk about how you balanced your student responsibilities with your coaching responsibilities.
Well, I mean, I scheduled my classes in the morning and early afternoon. That way I had the flexibility. I didn't have any commitments after 2:00, and was able to drive back. It was probably about a 25-minute ride from campus back to Newport, and made sure that, my classes were scheduled at great times so I could do it. And that way I didn't have, there was no worries where I couldn't make practice one day. And I just, I committed to it. And I committed to obviously getting my degree, but I committed to, this passion that I had just started. I just was like, this is really important to me. And I just wanted to make sure that however I needed to schedule and make time, that neither side, my academics, or my team, would be hurt by, lack of input or lack of, I guess for me, it's just, I didn't want to give less than 100% to either one.
Totally understand. And I think when you go back and you look at that situation, I have talked to other coaches who have kind of been in that same spot. I'm not sure I've talked to anybody who's been a varsity head coach while still in school. I've talked to a bunch of coaches who have been middle school coaches or even JV coaches while they're still finishing up their education. But I think your situation is clearly unique. So when you were a young guy like that and you take over the program, what do you remember about your vision for what you hope to create as the varsity head coach?
Well, again, I grew up I was fortunate. My high school head coach was a terrific coach and scout, and he actually took me along with him, and I actually went to some clinics early on and try to develop like kind of what my philosophy was going to be, how I wanted to go about things. And I was lucky to have some mentors then, my high school head coach, obviously, and then some older guys that were really good friends of him that were in the association, our coaches association in our state. And they kind of guided me along, and I kind of just followed on their coattails and, went to clinics and started to kind of begin to learn the lifelong process of learning. And I just kept learning and kept seeing what would be comfortable, what was I comfortable with, and what did I want to bring, and have them as a mainstay of our program.
All right. So what were you look back on those early few years as the head varsity coach, what were some things that you feel like you were good at right out of the gate? And what were some things that you look back on now and you're like, I'm not sure I was very good at that when I first started?
I think at that age, I think I was good in communicating to the players because of my ability to relate to them. And I think that, I think in relating to players as a strength, I think one of the weaknesses I had at the time was just the overall knowledge of the game. And I needed to continue to learn in all aspects, on offense and defense. And I began able to see, it wasn't as simple as the basic things that you do here on defense or the basic things you do on the other end on offense. There was so much more to the puzzle, and I only had a piece or two, and I needed to learn to that huge 1,000-piece puzzle or whatever size piece puzzle. I needed to start to collect the pieces and make sure that they fit.
I think now that's probably for coaches a little bit, if you're willing to put the time in and it means something to you, I think it's a little bit easier today to learn those X's and O's, or at least be able to find ways to study it and be able to reach out to other coaches and talk to people and use the internet. And the X's and O's piece always seems like, at least to me, the part that would be, again, saying it's the easiest is probably the wrong way to say it, but it's the most accessible thing out there, that if you want to find out more about basketball X's and O's, there are so many different ways to do it. And what I found through the podcast, and I think most people would probably agree with this, that there's so many coaches out there today that are willing to share their knowledge and share what they know. And then it's just so much easier to share that knowledge than it was 25 or 30 years ago when you were first starting. So talk to me maybe a little bit about the things that, who you went to or how you went about trying to learn maybe some of the other things around the program. Now, of course, the word would be culture. I'm not sure that was the way that we thought about it back in the time when you started, but just talk about some of the things that, you know, you had to do around building your team that weren't necessarily X's and O's related. Who did you talk to? How did you go about learning that? Was it by experience? Was it by talking to some of the mentors you mentioned earlier? Just talk a little bit about how you started thinking about the, quote, culture of your team.
Well, I mean, I was lucky that at the time, our football program at our high school at the time, back in the late 80s, early 90s, even before that, for a long time in history, was a powerhouse football team in our state. And the head coach was John Toba, and he was actually my first athletic director. And he was just a powerful figure from the leadership aspect that everyone in the community looked up to. And I remember going and having a conversation at his house one day, you know, just to learn more, obviously not about the X and the O because we're in a different sport at the time, but just to learn more. And I remember, I think it was my first year or the beginning of my second year, and he said something to me that has stuck with me, and I've shared this with his daughter and his son, that he said to me in a conversation that day that made me feel like $1 million. And I think it just grew my confidence that day. He said to me, "You're a white knight at that school." And I didn't know what it meant at the time. I just took it as a compliment, but it just threw my confidence through the roof. So then I became engaged with him about, you know, leading a team and, you know, what the key connection pieces are and the glue. And obviously, you know, he went about it one way, but he is, you know, he's a legend in our community. And I think that was one of the most important things that catapulted me into now, okay, looking at, you know, now I'm starting to collect, as I said, more pieces to the puzzle. And now my pieces are getting a little bigger. You know, how about leading a team and understanding it. And I didn't even know it then, you know, until I know so much now.
Right. How do you, when you look back on the totality of your time as the varsity coach, how would you describe the way that you went about building your relationships with your players in terms of having conversations with them, in terms of getting to know them both as players, but also as people off the floor? Was there anything that you did formally to make that happen, or was it done informally? Just talk to me a little bit about your process of building relationships with your kids.
You know, probably done informally. Obviously, I changed so much now, but I mean, I would spend time talking to them. You know what I mean? Before practice, after practice, during practice. You know, if they were shooting free throws, attending their other sports. You know, going to the other games if they played other sports, and you know, reaching out to them and just, you know, kind of just always staying in touch with them and talking to them. And obviously, for me, I was lucky with those relationships because they had trusted me because we had spent so much time together. They knew me, and then that really helped. I think it was immense for our program. I think it was the key to you know, what we accomplished. And after that, I just believe I just continued to do that because I had done it. But now the other relationships I was building kids didn't know me as well because it was like either the first or the second year or possibly the third year that they got to know me and understand me more. And, I wasn't able to reach everybody, which is what my goal was, but, I was able to reach so many, and I think that was probably how I connected with them the best.
I'm sure as an elementary school physical education teacher, in addition to being a coach, that your youth program was critical to the success of your program. So can you talk a little bit about how you built your youth program, what your philosophy was with your youth program, and then how that benefited you eventually as the high school varsity coach?
Well, our youth programs were in place at the time, and it was the key to our success, I believe, and always have believed this. And over time, some things have changed. But I believe at the time we had elementary basketball at the schools, and we had, I forget the time, maybe 6 or 7 elementary schools. And each elementary school had a 4th and a 5th grade team, had one team that represented their school and played against the other elementary school. So that was huge, as well as our local YMCA. We had our Flo Harvey League, so we added the boys clubs. And so those are all in place. And then in the middle school, there was an intramural program at the time with 6th graders, because 6th graders couldn't play in the middle school until they were 7th grade. And then obviously we had our middle school program, and the boys clubs and the YMCA still went on. And we also had our local recreation department that had basketball going on. And so those were all in place. And so as I was coaching, those were all in place. And then as the boys club started to expand and started to take kids out and travel to Providence or to Boston or to Connecticut to play games, all these extra things helped in our success of our program.
And how directly involved were you with any of that in terms of being visible to those younger kids? Because I think that's one of the things that I see that is, I think, slightly different in the high school basketball today, at least around here, where you don't necessarily always have that direct involvement from the varsity coach. And I think it's something that causes kids maybe not to aspire as much to be a part of their high school team eventually. And I think just the basketball system in general is just different. I think it's more individualistic today, as opposed to kids looking around and going, hey, I've been with this group of kids since we were in 3rd grade, can't wait to play together in high school. I think it's become more of an individual thing as opposed to a group thing or a team thing or a community thing. But just how much were you personally involved in any of those different aspects of the youth program that you described?
I wouldn't say that much. They were all running, and they were running great. And at the time, for me at that age, in my mid-20s, everything was being run, and I didn't know any better, what needed to be done, and they were doing a great job. And so I think I had stopped in maybe when they had asked me to come and do some clinics for them. I would go down absolutely with some of our guys and do those. But I wasn't heavily involved in that development. There were some great things already in place, and we had obviously lots of numbers at the high school and the middle school trying out. But again, I didn't have anybody that would help me kind of mentor me. I mean, I had my mentors, but I had no one that would say, you got to be more, visible there. So I didn't, obviously on Saturdays we were always off anyways. So for me, it became a family time. And I didn't have any children at the time, but for me, it was like my kids needed to be with their families. And for me, it was like, okay, I was like breaking down tape and doing all the other stuff, not understanding what the importance was of, at that time, the sense of community.
Yeah, and young coaches today have no idea what breaking down tape looked like in the late 80s, early 90s. So it's a little bit of a different animal then than it is now.
Sure was, man. Lots of tape, man.
It's funny. I remember it both from a playing perspective and and early in my coaching career perspective. And probably the thing that sticks with me the most is, as a player, more so even than a coach, and sitting in the locker room with both my high school coach and even in college. And coach having the old VHS tapes and having the remote control in their hand and say, okay, we're gonna see this play again, and hitting the rewind button and then missing the play by like a minute and a half because the thing went too far and they couldn't get it stopped, and then you end up watching something that they didn't want to watch anyway, and you'd rewatch that like 7 times and you couldn't get to the right place, and it was so incredibly inefficient. And now you think about how the tape, how you can send it off, send your film off to Huddle or some other service, and within 6 hours or 2 hours or whatever it is, the turnaround time is just incredible, and get it all broken down by this and that and stats and everything else. It's amazing. I think probably young coaches who weren't around in those days have no idea what the how time consuming and inefficient that process of breaking down tape was. Back in the day of, again, like I said, in the 80s and 90s, it was just completely inefficient.
Absolutely. I mean, now the efficiency is so much better, but the value of that hard work you cannot replace. I mean, I would obviously like to, save more time and be more efficient with time, but the value of what you put into breaking those tapes down and the knowledge you continue to grow, and how you had to work hard to break that tape down and spend time was worth it, because it brought in habits.
Yeah, I think that there's something to be said for that when you think about the investment of time, and this doesn't just apply to film study, but I think it goes to something greater that you're hitting on, which is when you put in the investment of time, that could be as a coach, that could be as a player, then you become more invested in those ultimate results. And I think that's something that is a lesson that we can all teach as basketball coaches or as teachers, to be able to share with our students that when you put more into it, when you put effort into whatever it is that you're going to do, you're going to take more pride in it, and ultimately you're going to end up being more successful because of that effort and because it was meaningful for you. And I think that as, again, a basketball coach, those are the kinds of life lessons that you're trying to teach your kids beyond the game of basketball. I think that's something that's very, very important. So when you think about that aspect of coaching and just being able to share with your kids, not just teach them how to become better basketball players, but just impart those life lessons that are going to help them be a success in whatever endeavor they end up doing when they're older. Talk a little bit about how you try to share your life lessons with them to help them not only be better basketball players, but be better people.
I guess for me, the life lessons started at my days at 5-Star Basketball Camp. And I say that with true love, because I remember being at a lecture with one of the coaches, Jerry Wainwright. Jerry Wainwright at the time was at Wake Forest, and then as an assistant, I think during the time we worked at camp together, he ended up being the head coach of UNC Wilmington. And Jerry had a lecture the 25th anniversary week about life. And that impacted me so much. And then a few more lectures of Jerry through the years were the same or little changes. It impacted me so much to the point that when I started our basketball camp in 1995, that every Friday's lecture was the same. This is going to be our 25th anniversary this summer if we have camp, who's to know. But from the beginning of 1 week sessions to 2 or 3 week sessions, every Friday lecture has always been the same. And it was always been titled Being a Good Person. And it just talked about life with the kids. And then I shared a story about when I was younger, and one of my good friends playing on a Saturday afternoon flicked something at my eye. And basically, long story short, I had to have patches on my eyes for 6 days back then, no drops. So and it's part of that life's lesson where I share with the kids the story, and they all know the story and they talk about it. But for me, it was 6 days at the age of 15, understanding of what it was like to be blind, where I could only change the patches at night in the pitch black of the bathroom, and all day long for 6 days I had to wear patches. So it was such an impactful time for me, and I share that every Friday of our lectures about being a good person, and using those powerful words of please, thank you, and I love you. Those 6, they're 5 words, but we use one more, twice. So those 6 powerful words, and I share that story. And then, so for years, I've been able to relay that to my kids on all levels at the high school and even in our youth camps and our kids.
Yeah, it's powerful to be able to share a personal experience, a personal story that's applicable to kids' lives, that they can see somebody that is in front of them that they respect, somebody that they know, and showing your own vulnerability and showing the fact that you're a human being. And then when you do that, I think that is very impactful for kids. It's one thing for you to tell a story about somebody else. I think it's another thing for you to tell a story about yourself and something that you were able to overcome. And personal experiences in your own life, I think, are a great way to be able to teach kids those life lessons through the game of basketball. And so I'm sure that that's a powerful story that when you're telling it, I'm sure that the kids at basketball camp are sitting and staring up at you. And I know what that feeling is like from running basketball camp here. We're in the same boat that you are, wondering whether or not we're going to have it. This summer is going to be year 28 for me with youth basketball camps in the summer. And so the ability to stand in front of 75 or 100 kids and share those things and be able to teach those life lessons. And one of the things that we always do is we spend a lot of time talking about sportsmanship at our basketball camp and how important that is, and just why that has an impact, not just on what you do today as an athlete, but how important it is just in life to be able to treat people that you're interacting with in a positive way. And I know that when I do that and I stand up and share my stories, kids get quiet and they're listening because they want to hear from somebody who they know and somebody that they can relate to. And I'm sure it's the same there for you. Coaches, we've teamed up with Coach Tyler Whitcomb so you can now purchase his exclusive new playbooks right from the Hoopheads Pod website. If you're looking for ways to improve your team next season, these playbooks blend affordability with the quality content that serious coaches are looking for. Just visit hoopheadspod.com/store and you'll find playbooks from John Calipari of Kentucky, Leonard Hamilton from Florida State, and Mike Young of Virginia Tech. Check out these great resources at hoopheadspod.com/store. You touched on 5-star, and I know we talked about it before we jumped on today, how important and influential that was in your coaching career. So this seems like a time that we can jump into that. I'll tell you a quick Jerry Wainwright story from my time. So I went to 5-star just once as a player between my junior and senior year. And the thing that I remember about Jerry Wainwright, and it's not necessarily, it's just what I remember, is the whole week that I was there, I felt like he never had a shirt on.
You're right.
I feel like he never wore a shirt. My recollection of him, I can see him like standing under the pine trees at the one end of the courts right before you go up the hill with his shirt off, and I have this very vivid picture of him just being all over the camp, but without a shirt. So it's not a very basketball related story about him, but that's what I remember from my week at 5-star.
You are right, Mike, because that was Jerry. As hot as it was on those courts in Pittsburgh or in Holmesdale, I mean, it was, we didn't have the air-conditioned gyms back then. It was like, so I remember Jerry, I just looked through photos this morning, last week, on Facebook on the 5-star site. And again, you saw pictures of Jerry with no shirt on, and it was just comical that you would say that.
So how'd you get connected to 5-star? What's the first connection? How do you get an opportunity to go out there and work?
So while I was at University of Rhode Island, I would play in the off season with some of the players, when they had pickup games, after the season or before the season. And one of the guys that was manager, I actually became good friends with two of the former players that had another year of academics. They were brothers, and they had, on the team was a manager. Well, that manager, one of the managers on the team at the time was Lee Klein. So they connected me. Obviously we played in a mural. I played in a murals with the two brothers, great in a mural team, 6'8", 6'9", it was nice to have them as your big guys. But
that's nice. That's a nice intramural team.
Oh yeah. So, but they connected me to Lee after hearing about me and coaching. And then Lee asked me if I would want to work camp. And that was back in, my first year was the summer of 1989. And I started there at camp there. And I remember going down the first time, and, I wasn't a station master. And I went around camp, and I had my notebook. And I'm sitting there watching John Calipari, who's an assistant at Pittsburgh at the time, and Pete Gillen. And it went on, and the lectures. And that was like, for me, like getting a master's degree, the beginning of getting a master's degree that would take, years and years to learn, and just being a sponge. And just all of a sudden now, second year, first year as head coach, just finished, and I went to camp there. And it was like basketball heaven at the time. You were at camp for 7 days, and we worked like 16-hour days. And at that age, we all loved it. And I spoke to some of the guys this past week. We'd give a week to go back to have that atmosphere and that the way it was. But it just, for me, became like, wow, there's so much more than going to a clinic. Back then, it was USA basketball clinics that were in hotels. This was like you were being indoctrinated into really what basketball was and the lifeblood of it, because at the time, 5-star was it everywhere. It was the best teaching camp at the time, and it was like, the quote is, where the teaching never stops. So that's where it started for me, was with Lee Klein.
It was such a different era, and it was such a different time, and you look back on that, and I just think about the amount of, as you said, teaching that went on at 5-star, and going through and doing the stations. And obviously then you had the quote optional station 13, where not only did the players want to be a part of that, but it was such an honor for coaches to be able to be selected to be the coach of station 13. And then the thing that always strikes me about it, especially when we compare it to sort of the way the basketball world is today, it's amazing when you look back at some of the players that went through there, and you think that basically they were playing on converted tennis courts, outdoors on the cement, in the hot sun. And these are the best guys across the country that would annually make that trip to 5-star. And you compare and contrast that with sort of today's, you think about the top 50 players back then, the top 50 players today. And, the top 50 players today are traveling around the country and playing in air-conditioned gyms and have gear that's paid for by one of the shoe companies. And it's such a different atmosphere. And it would be interesting to, if you could throw both groups in a time machine and take the best high school players from the late 80s, early 90s, and catapult them up into the 2020s and have them play in the situation that we have today. And then conversely, to take the guys from today and throw them back out on the tennis courts in the 100-degree weather, and just let each group experience what the group today or the group in the past was experiencing. And I think it'd be interesting to be able to have those conversations with guys, because the system is just so different. And obviously I always say that when you're talking to somebody who's kind of from our era, I'm very nostalgic for that old time basketball, where there was more pickup ball, there was more of those fundamental camps, as opposed to the AAU circuit that we have today. And I know there's good and bad to both systems, but I think that if you put a player from 2020 back at 5-star in 1987, they would be looking around going, what is this? Why are we out here on the tennis courts in 100-degree weather?
Yeah, I think one of the things that obviously to me that stand out is the amount of distractions that are that kids during this time have. Where back then there was no distraction. You were at camp. You could only use a pay phone to reach out to try to touch base with somebody. There was no outside touching, communication with anybody. You were at camp, and it was like you were fully engaged in everything that was going on, and it was only one thing that mattered at the time, and it was basketball. And now there's so many distractions of AAU tournament or coaches or social media. I mean, it goes on and on. And I think obviously that would be a unique thing to see, the past against the present. But I think the value of that really, that hard work and ethic of like devoting and committing and pouring everything in and not allowing any distraction to be part of it, it was unique back then. And I just wish, I'm not speaking on behalf of everybody, but that laser-like focus, that bullseye mentality was, I believe, like back from our culture and our time that, I would love to see more of now. And I think it will come back in some phase, some way.
How did you handle that sort of changing player, just changing environment over the course of, your 26 years as the varsity coach? I'm sure that aspect of it changed in terms of how you dealt with players and how you were trying to figure out how to best reach them. So can you talk a little bit about just maybe how you had to handle things differently as those changes came to be? So as phones became more prevalent, as these distractions became more prevalent, did you have to make any adjustments in terms of how you tried to get your players to focus in when they were with you, as at practice or games or whatever the situation may have been?
Yeah, I mean, the phone started to come in a little bit towards the end there. But for me, the focus, for our guys, communication, with them was always just, trying to reach out. And sometimes it was tough when you get a kid who transferred in that may have been at another school, wherever, and developing that rapport and that relationship with kids. And if it was giving them a ride home or giving them a ride home, if they needed, obviously, rides, because our high school was in the other end of town. I think, like one of the things was, kids used to like to listen to music, and it was great, but like, I think it was like what we did every day, and that's what culture is. But for us back then, it was like, this is what we did all the time, was like when guys wanted to listen to music or, it was fine. But when it was during the JV game was going to start, we took all our headphones off. It was like we were focused on supporting our team, our JVs, and building, that togetherness where our varsity was going to root for our junior varsity. And, like on bus rides up, we'd listen to headphones and everybody be in silence. We would have a bus ride that was just focused on what we needed to do. So I think a lot of those types of things I did to try to, develop a program of, togetherness and teamwork, outside of the basketball court alignment. I didn't get to answer your question with the phones as much, but I guess for me, it was more of like, look, we're focused on our group here. There's a time and a place for it, and this is not the time or place for it.
Makes total sense. One more 5-star question. When you think back to all the great lectures that you heard, and we mentioned before we jumped on that you had some tapes of some of those things that you were able to save and keep from your time there. Is there one particular lecture or maybe two that stand out to you, or a personality, one of the coaches that just really, you already mentioned Coach Wainwright's speech and how that impacted you, but is there one or two others that you remember the message, you remember the charisma of the speaker, somebody that really you listened to and you were like, wow, I gotta make sure that I incorporate this into my coaching, or just something that struck you through some of the great lectures you were able to hear as part of 5-star?
Yes, Hubie Brown and Rick Pitino. The way that you could see that, Hubie Brown spoke, the way he used his voice, the way he elevated his tone, the way he commanded the audience. And the audience at the time was the players and the coaches. The way he taught the aspects, and he didn't speak fast. There was so much, like it was like a wave of his knowledge coming out in his voice and just controlling the room. And then you could see Rick Pitino had that same passion, but that same the use of his voice where he could control the room and reach inside everybody's brain and register and say, hey, listen, this is what's important. And everyone would be laser-like focused, paying attention. Obviously, you had some people who were nodding off because they were tired from lack of sleep. But I remember those. And then again, I guess I'd say Marv Kessler and his humor. Marv Kessler was the poet of the hardware, Goff used to call him. And just his humor and his knowledge of basketball, but the way he delivered it was his shtick, as they used to call it. How he delivered a lecture, and how knowledgeable he was, but he delivered it in a different way than Hubie Brown and Rick Pitino did. But yet, the bottom line was the same. They were educating and teaching the players and coaches.
Yeah, it's just amazing. Not only the players that went through there, but when you just think about it's basically a roll call of the who's who of coaching. And I think that's the piece of it, that it's one thing to be able to attract the great players year after year after year, but to be able to attract the quality and level of coaches that were part of that five-star family was just an incredible, incredible accomplishment. And I think that's what made it so unique and special. And it's one of those things, like we talked about off the top, that I get nostalgic whenever we talk about it, just because, again, I only went to 1 week and I never went there as a coach. Only went there for 1 week as a player, but yet it just felt like such a legendary place to be because of all the great people, excuse me, that have gone through there. When you were there, who was a player that made an impact on you, just in terms of, wow, this kid is a special player, a special person? Who was there? Anybody that the audience may recognize the name, somebody that really stood out for you while you were coaching at Five Star?
Vince Carter. Vince Carter, Stephon Marbury. They just did a piece on Stephon Marbury the other day. But I remember having Vince Carter on my team when he was a junior in Pittsburgh. We were at camp. I think it was P3. He was a junior. No one knew about him yet. And I remember we were practicing and working on him coming off the screen and roll, and trying to teach him the options and the angles. And I just remember him, having so much gifted athletic ability. It was unbelievable. And next thing you know, he has a great junior season. Before you know it, he's like becomes a high school American, the next year. And Stephon Marbury, I would say, I mean, there were so many Big East, ACC type, Atlantic 10. I mean, kids that went to the elite schools. I remember him at, and I never forget, it was a playoff game one night in Honesdale up in the mountains. It's in August. And one of the games had gone like a couple of overtimes. So this game, and I'll never forget, it was on court 4. And it got delayed. So the rest of the games had kind of finished ahead. So this game got a really late start. So Stephon Marbury was on the court, and obviously there was a bunch of kids from all over, but there was a great mix of New York City kids. And the court started to grow with more and more campers around the perimeter watching this game. It became one of the most competitive games I have ever seen on any level at high school or college. It was like you were playing an NBA championship, or you were playing in the national championship for college on that court at that time. And I remember Stephon being in the game, and just the competition, and then just the excitement from the fans around it. Even the coaches were watching the game, because it was like the last game going on. It was behind 45 minutes from when we were supposed to finish everything, and just watching that impact. And I remember Stephon being in that game, and just how terrific player he was.
That to me really is what basketball is all about. When I think about some of my fondest memories, yeah, they're I have great memories of organized basketball, being a high school player and having the good fortune to be able to be a college player. But a lot of my best memories are just playing pickup basketball on the playground, on the asphalt with guys of all different ages and all different walks of life. And I probably have just as fond of memories or just as many memories from that time of my life as compared to organized basketball. And I think when you see an impromptu game like a camp game is, that's somewhat organized, but obviously not to the same degree of a high school or college game. And as you said, when that level of competition, when it gets down to, and you boil basketball down to that me versus you aspect of it, and I think that's when it really gets fun. And I think, we talked about off the top of the podcast about what makes you fall in love with the game of basketball. And for me, it was always that competition of, I could always have a measuring stick to try to prove myself against you. So it all ultimately comes down to, even within that 5-on-5 game, there's still those 1 versus 1 battles that the competition boils down to. And I'm sure you think back to that game that you were describing that Marbury's playing in, and I'm sure there was some kid who didn't have the reputation that Marbury had that was out there saying, I'm going to guard this guy and I'm going to give him everything I have. And to me, that's really what basketball boils down to, is that fun, me versus you. We're testing ourselves against each other. And I'm sure that you felt that as a player. You probably felt it as a coach when you're out there just competing and trying to do your best. And that's what makes the game fun.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more, Mike. You hit it 100%.
All right, let me ask you about, let's jump back to you as a high school coach. Talk to me a little bit about, I know one of the things that that coaches have to deal with all the time and figure out what their philosophy is going to be in regards to parents. So talk to me a little bit about how you try to engage the parents of your players in your program so that you can ensure that you had the support of the parents of your players.
I think just the way I treated the kids. I mean, obviously, we had some high standards at the time. I think, getting their involvement and support of, if it was, gatherings at, our players' houses, or, if we were going to have a gathering at our house, the parents helped contribute, towards that. But just their support. Like, I was lucky to have my, start out with a group, and I was lucky to have supportive parents, and I truly believe, that obviously, not everyone agrees with every decision you make, but I believe at that time, they were supportive of us and what we did, and they were supportive of our program, but they were supportive in the way that, they, kind of kept their distance, and agree or disagree, they just kept their distance. And I think that's how they were supportive to us as I reflect back. And, there'd be conversations you might have with them, but nothing about like playing time or anything like that. I think they trusted my decision making, even though I was younger. Obviously was going to make tons of mistakes, but I think they, valued the relationships that I had developed with their kids, and they trusted me. And then, obviously it was a learning process every day and every year where you had to learn from mistakes. But I just believe that, I had their best interest at heart, and may have not looked at that like at that time, but I think, the kids truly knew that I had their best interest, and I think the parents knew, that I supported the kids in whatever they needed, or they wanted from us, what they might need for leadership or guidance or that father figure. I try to provide for a lot of them, because and my dad had passed away at a younger age, so for me it was almost like I became a father figure to a lot of them.
Yeah, I think that trust and building that relationship with the kids first, and when parents see that you have their kids' best interests at heart, I think that tends to alleviate a lot of issues that might end up being a factor if the parents didn't feel that way about their head coach. Because if they know that you have the best interests of their child at heart, and they know that you're communicating with their child and with them, and it just makes things a lot easier when you have that trust and you have that relationship. And especially for you, as you went along in your career, I'm sure that once you've been there 10, 12, 15 years, that trust factor becomes even stronger, and especially as your program has success. And I'm sure that makes it easier to be able to handle and engage the parents and get their support. And over time, I know that that's something that most coaches, as they go along and further in their career, they get better at figuring out how to manage those parent relationships so that you end up keeping your parents being supportive. Because obviously as a coach, your situation is much better when you have the support of parents as opposed to a situation where you have parents grumbling in the stands all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting because, I've learned so much by watching, but having my children, one go through high school, now in college, and then one going through high school now, being able to sit from a different seat. But I was always very mindful of when my kids started playing, all the things that I watched when I went to scout and see parents in the stands, and just kind of learning from situations like, how I wanted to be as a parent, and understanding after I had kids, you know what I mean, that, okay, now I was able to see things from a different perspective from their eyes now rather than from my eyes as a coach when I first started, because my first one, my daughter Joy was not born until 1999. So I had already been in coaching at the time for 10 years, and I didn't have the lens to see the eyes of a parent until after my kids were born. Now I was looking through a different set of glasses and totally understanding in a much better aspect. So for me, it was a different learning curve that now as a parent, as I say to my friends, if I get back into the game, if the timing is right, the situation's right, I am 100 times a better coach than the day I retired. So I think the value of learning the relationships with parents and seeing different things on both sides of it as a coach and now a parent has been really beneficial to me.
Becoming a parent, I think there's no question that changes your perspective on how you look at things. And I'll share a story from my own coaching background. When I was a young coach and I got my first teaching job, I think I was 25 when I got my first teaching job, and I was an assistant varsity coach, and we had a JV coach who was just out of college, who was 2 years younger than me, and our varsity coach was maybe in his early 30s. And there were times where we would have, in the preseason, we'd have these 3.5-hour practices, and school would end and we'd be practicing, and nobody had any idea, ourselves, our staff included, of when these practices were going to end. And I think back to that now, and of course at that point I was a single guy, no kids, no wife, nowhere really to be, so it didn't matter. We could have practiced for a half hour, or we could have practiced for 6 hours. It really didn't make any difference. But now you look back at that and you think, boy, that had to be really annoying for parents, that their kid would be at practice and they would have no idea what time that practice was going to end. And this was probably 1995, 1996. So you're talking about a lot of people at that point, kids didn't have phones, and they weren't able to communicate, hey, it's time to come pick me up. And were parents sitting outside the school waiting for, in their cars for an hour? I have no idea, because it just wasn't even on my radar. And so to your point, I think as you grow and mature and you become a parent yourself, it definitely changes the way you look at some of the things you do as a coach. And I know it changed me as a teacher, thinking about just, again, trying to remember that this kid who's in front of me is somebody's kid, and I have to make sure that I'm doing the best that I can, just like their parents doing the best that they can for them. And I think that's important for coaches and teachers to remember. And I think it's a perspective that you really only get when you have your own kids and you have your own family, because when you're single and you don't have kids, there's just no way to look at it through, as you said, the same lens that you do once you have a family. And that leads to my next question, which is, once you had your family, how did you balance your ambition as a basketball coach with the needs of your family at home? Because I know that's one of the things that we've talked with a lot of coaches about on the podcast when they talk about some of their biggest challenges. And they always say that trying to be able to figure out how to dedicate the amount of time that they want to dedicate to their basketball, and yet they also want to be able to be there and be a good father, be a good husband, and be there with their family. So how did you balance that once your family got started?
It was balancing. It was a interesting balancing act. My two are 4.5 years apart, but I remember, having to really understand how to budget my time better, and I think I didn't do a greater job with it early on because I just didn't know any better. I mean, I grew up as an only child, so I didn't have any siblings, and then so there was a lot of things that I didn't understand in raising the family, and so I think there was a learning process even now as a parent, as all parents have. But I believe that there was so many things that I had to change from. I was still like so passionate about the game, but now obviously you appreciate when you don't have children. The time you said to yourself, what did I do with all that time?
No doubt about that. Yeah, I can relate to that statement for sure.
Exactly. So
I stopped sleeping. That's what I did.
Right. So I think I had to really learn, and it was like my kids were everything, but it was like I loved basketball so much that I needed to something to change so I could completely understand what it meant to be a parent and a father. And I did I worked hard at it and did the best I can, and still working at it, because we're always working at trying to get better for our kids. But it was tough, because there'd be times when I was, how it is. You're getting back late from a game, or you're not there to pick up your kid from school, and you come home and it's dinner time, it's time for bed, and you just didn't feel like you were spending the time. It's kind of as that period of time went on, I think things started to change a little bit for me, and it became I ended up being in a new phase of basketball, and it just kind of things started to change for me. And I think being a parent now, as my kids were getting to that age where they were in elementary school, middle school, I started to see some changes.
Yeah, and I don't think you can anticipate that, like we said earlier, before you have kids. I don't think you can really understand what that's like. And I know for me, it was tough. When I stepped away from high school coaching, I was probably living about 45 minutes away from my school. I was the only person who kept moving further and further away from my job over the course of the time where I worked there. And so then it became where, we'd have a home game, and I used to be able to go home right after school and, grab a bite to eat with my wife and my kids, and, then still get back up to the school for the game. And now that I'm living farther away, I couldn't do that. And I was just gone all the time, and it was difficult. And eventually I decided that it was time for me to step away and look for a different way to impact kids through basketball and coaching at the high school level. And I stepped away from it, and because I just couldn't find that right balance with my commute and just all the things that went along with it. And I know that it's something that coaches struggle with, and everybody has to figure it out. And as you said, there's definitely a learning curve to figuring out how do I make this work so I don't shortchange one side of the equation against the other. And it's tough. I mean, coaches struggle with it. I want to go to what you're doing now with your youth camps and with your academy. So talk a little bit about when you got that started, how you got it started, and then what you love about working those and having those youth camps.
So it started when I retired in 2014. I obviously wanted to stay involved. I wanted to continue to teach. So I camp actually, at that point in 2014, was still rolling, and still to this day I run the camp. And the academy I started in the fall after I retired, and I do it in the fall and the spring for like a 6-week period. And I've changed the ages of it a little bit over the years to try to get a better balance of and basically it's me just to give the kids an opportunity to continue to learn, to be coached, to teach, the things I love and miss about the game, and relationships with these kids. And some of these kids I have in elementary school, and then they move up to the middle school, so I have a foundation of relationships with a lot of them. Some that I don't. It gives me the opportunity to build more relationships, and for me, I think that's one of the things I miss was the relationships with teams, building relationships with kids, having lifelong relationships with them. And I think the academy and the camps have allowed me to stay in contact. I have now obviously communication with the coaches that work for us in camp in the summer. And, it's a lot of it for me has become giving back to the community. And I found that probably about 15, 20 years ago, how important it was to give back to our communities. And I wanted to continue to give back to our community with camp and continue it. And I wanted to even branch out and run Skills Academy to teach the kids, and give back and say, hey, look, you don't need to travel 45 minutes or 50 minutes or an hour away. We have knowledge right here in our area. I've got experiences that I will share, and I'm continuing to educate myself, and I've never stopped learning. And so I continue to learn and apply even the things that are in the game now on top of what I already knew. So I'm trying to expand my portfolio from aspect of my knowledge and my experience and share not only for my Skills Academy, but my former assistants, my former players who are out coaching, if it's AAU, middle school or high school, assistant coach, freshman coach, varsity coach, even coaches that were in our coaches association. I'm trying to be a mentor to them, and I'm trying to expand that aspect. That's something of a newer phase, and say, hey, look, there's a lot you need to know about coaching. I don't have all the answers, but I've been through lots of experiences, and I want to give back to our community and to our state or whoever would want to listen. That's where, it's just a matter of you want to listen.
Yeah, that's very cool to be able to reach out and have an impact, not just on players, but to be able to impact coaches. And I think that's how you multiply your influence, is not only are you able to work with the players that are right in front of you, but when you can work with coaches, and then those coaches can go out and share and teach the game and utilize the things that you've been able to impart to them. To me, that's tremendously valuable. And that's an area that I see more and more coaches diving into. And it's an area that, because of the technology that we have available to us, it makes it so much easier for us to be able to share not only in person our knowledge with other coaches, but now obviously during this time when we're all shut down, people are all figuring out how to use Zoom and how to use Google Hangouts and different things. And of course, what we're doing here with the podcast is another way for coaches to be able to have a platform to share with other coaches and help them to become better at their craft. And to me, that's really what it's all about when we think about coaches helping coaches. I want to ask you one final question about the youth camps, and then we'll start to wrap things up. And that is, when you think about running a youth camp, and this is something that is near and dear to my heart as somebody who's done it for a long, long time, what is one key thing that you think is really, really important when you're running a quality youth camp? If you had to pick out one thing that, when you think about your camps, what's something that sort of encapsulates what you're trying to accomplish during your camp with the kids?
Having fun.
There you go. That's number one. Couldn't agree more.
When we finish our camp week outside, right after my final lecture, we have a camp knockout game. And, our numbers are probably, we have limited numbers for weeks, because I don't want to have a lot of kids in our camp, because I want kids to have relationships with the coaches. Every coach, I told them when they start the day, you need to know every kid's name by the end of the week. And so we get in the camp knockout game. We might have, 40 to 50 kids with the coaching staff. We play a knockout game, and the winner of the knockout game, the opposite group has to do push-ups. So coaches against the campers. And it is what every camper looks forward to all week long, and it is so much fun, when they beat the coaching staff and then we have to do the push-ups, it's like they've all won $1 million. So that would, to me, be what camp would be about. It would be about fun every day, obviously learning, getting better, but it'd be about having fun.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I think that if you're a coach out there and you're thinking about putting together a youth camp or you're already running one, I think that you have to remember, especially when you're working with young kids, that the most important thing you can do is make sure they have fun. Then the second thing is make sure they learn something. And the third thing that I always point out to parents and the kids on the first day is what we hope is that this 3 days or 5 days or 1 day or however long it is, the event that we're doing, that when they're done with it, that we've inspired them to want to go and play more basketball. And you try to inspire that love of the game. And we all know as coaches that if we can inspire the love of the game in our players at whatever age, then those are the kids who are going to go out and work at it and get better and improve. And that's really what it's all about. Before we wrap up, Jim, I want to give you a chance to share how people can get in touch with you. If you want to share an email, a website, social media, whatever you'd like to share so people can reach out to you if they have questions or they just want to get in connection with you, go ahead and do that now, and then I'll jump back in and wrap things up.
Okay, so my email address is B as in boy again, the word doctor, number 1 at me.com. It's bbdoctor1@me.com. My website is my last name, Psaras.net, and that has everything on there about camps, Skills Academy, and even a background of me in there as well. And then my YouTube channel is my first name, but James, my last name, Psaras, Psaras @gmail.com, and that's where we have a bunch of stuff. And I would say those are the most important ones now. You can reach me on either email, bbdoctor1@me.com, or jamespsaras@gmail. And then the website, psaras.net. And obviously, if anybody would love to call, I'm easy to contact. My number is 401-641-2316. And I just, I want to continue to give back. So, like you said, we've been starting some social, some media, some Zooms as of last night with coaches, and we're trying to expand that and give back and hopefully, continue to share and most important, continue to learn.
Absolutely. Jim, cannot thank you enough for spending an hour and 20 minutes or so here with us this morning. It's been a pleasure getting to hear a little bit more about your story and all the great things you learned over the course of your long career there as a head varsity basketball coach in Rhode Island. So thank you for jumping out with us. And to everyone out there, we will catch you on our next episode. Thanks. Hey everyone, last year at the Junior NBA Summit, I came across an amazing company called iSport360 and its founder, Ian Goldberg. Their youth sports app gets coaches, players, and parents on the same page. Your team can set goals, share player feedback, training videos, sticker rewards, player evals, and practice assignments. All of this to foster a healthy team communication and culture. If your team or club struggles to keep open lines of communication, especially among teen parents, iSport360 can help. If you want to empower your athletes to have more success, more confidence, and more communication with their teammates, give iSport360 a try today. Shoot me an email, mike@hoopheadspod.com, or give me a call at 216-392-4059 to learn more. Being without basketball right now is tough for all of us. So we've partnered with Pro Skills Basketball to offer you a 50% discount on their ultimate shooting guide and video program that will put players on a guided path to becoming the best shooter they can be. With 1 year's worth of workouts that includes games, drills, and competitions, players will gain access to a blueprint showing them what it takes to become an elite level shooter. If you're looking to improve your shooting at home, this program can help. Visit hoopheadspod.com/store to check it out.
Thanks for listening to the Hoop Heads podcast, presented by Head Start Basketball.